And if you're just joining us, we're just waiting for the majority of everyone to enter the virtual space. If you are here, hello, thanks for joining us this evening. All right, we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Hi, I'm Julia with Politics in Prose. We're live with author Anushay Hossain, Soraya Shamali, Jill Filipovic, and Sophia A. Nelson discussing Anushay Hossain's The Pain Gap, How Sexism and Racism in Healthcare Kill Women. We'll put a link in the chat feature so you can get the book directly from us at Politics in Prose. If you have a question for the author or this panel, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll move to questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen. And we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We're very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce this book and these panelists. Following in the footsteps of feminist manifestos such as The Feminine Mystique and Rage Becomes Her, The Pain Gap is an eye-opening and stirring call to arms that encourages women to flip their hysteria complex on its head and use it to revolutionize women's healthcare. The book tells the story of Hossain's experiences, from growing up in South Asia surrounded by staggering maternal mortality rates, to lobbying for global health legislation on Capitol Hill, to nearly becoming a statistic herself. Along the way, she realized that a little fury might be just what the doctor ordered. Meticulously researched and deeply reported, this book explores real women's traumatic experiences with America's healthcare system and empowers everyone to use their experiences to bring about the healthcare revolution women need. Author Anushay Hossain is a writer and a feminist policy analyst focusing on women's health legislation. She's a regular on-air guest at CNN, MSNBC, and PBS, and her writing on politics, gender, and race has been published in various periodicals. You can find her everywhere. She's also the host of the Spilling Chai podcast. The Pain Gap is her first book. With us is Soraya Shamali, the award-winning author of Rage Becomes Her, a writer and activist whose work focuses on the role of gender in culture, politics, religion, and media. She is the director of the Women's Media Center Speech Project and an advocate for women's freedom of expression and expanded civic and political engagement. And Jill Filipovic is a Brooklyn-based journalist, lawyer, and author of The H-Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness, a weekly columnist for CNN, and a 2019 New America Future of War Fellow. She is also a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times and a former columnist for The Guardian. Her work has appeared in several distinguished periodicals and the anthologies Nasty Women and Yes Means Yes. Thanks for being with us, Jill. And of course, Sophia A. Nelson is an award-winning American author and journalist. You can see her regularly on CNN's Inside Politics and Newsroom as a legal and political analyst. Nelson is an adjunct professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Christopher Newport University. Her extensive background includes having covered former First Lady Michelle Obama at the White House from 2010 to 2012. She's the author of a lot of books, including The Women Code, Black Woman Redefined, and E Pluribus One, and she just let us know her forthcoming book, Be the One You Need, will be published in 2022. So enough for me. We want to get to this great panel. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Anushay Hossain, Soraya Shamali, Jill Filipovic, and Sophia A. Nelson. Thank you all so much. We'll throw it to you.
Mute. Okay, I'm unmuted. How difficult is this? Well, before we start taking questions, I just want to say that each of the women here not only blurbed my book, but has inspired me motivated me, helped me. Jill, there are literally sentences in the introduction of my book, which I think you crafted with me and pulled me through. So I cannot thank you enough. Soraya, your book is in my overview, in my introduction, I should say, overview, because you inspired me so much. And Sophia, there would be no book without you. So thank you so much. And I'm so excited to start talking about this. I almost want to hand it over to you, Soraya, because what do you have to say about the pain gap and how women need to flip our hysteria complex and stop being so polite and nice about our health?
You know, I'm so grateful to you, first of all, for including me today, but really for writing this book. I think that all of us here really understand the power of sharing information like this with people. And I've just gotten to the point, I think, where I feel very strongly that all of our work, but this book in particular, needs to be read by men. We focus so much on ourselves and what we can do and how we can use different words or use different information. And I think all of us also do deeply research our work. And we are really committed to the idea that that kind of information needs to be rigorous and it needs to be something that is defensible. But in fact, sometimes so much of what we're saying, particularly what you're talking about in this book, requires a shift in the way people think of us as individuals and human beings. You know, it's not even so much the intellectual information, the scientific information, as much as their perceptions and stereotypes and the kinds of biases that you write about that need confronting. And as is the case, I think certainly with my book, sometimes people say, well, you know, how do you get men to read this book? And the reason I'm focused on that is because they simply have more resources and power in society, you know, and I've been winnowed down occasionally to saying, you know, sometimes you just have to make sure you hand it to them. Literally say, it's really important for you to kind of understand what I go through, you know, what I'm living through, and what the people that you know that happen to be feminine or female identifying. And sometimes really it's also including feminine people who aren't women, right? Like, and this is what happens when we encounter bias in the medical system, or frankly in schools and other institutions that have proto medical caring responsibility.
Well, we have been educating women about women's rights for so long, women's health, women's rights. And I always say, because I'm from Bangladesh and we had to work on so much international development and everything when I was growing up in the 80s. And I'm like, even the poorest, most uneducated woman knows, right, when her rights are being abused. Even when she knows she doesn't have any rights, she knows something is wrong. But if we can't educate the other half, I mean, those are our allies, and they're such powerful allies. We can't do this work with men. And when we had our launch party for the Pain Gap 2 days ago, all my women friends were so great. You know, even though they're married, a lot of them are married to feminist men. They were like, you come too.
Yes.
This is not a pink wine night for women to let us know about how we have to deal with medical misogyny. But really quick, Sophia, before I go to you, Jill, I want to ask you, I mean, what do you think, as one of those white women, I'm not going to say woke, but who really gets it? How do we bring more of not only our male allies, but our white allies to just say, hey, racism is not personal, but can we just talk about it, because it's literally killing us? How do we do that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I wish I knew the silver bullet answer, right? Because we would have, life would be a lot better if we did. Yeah, I think one thing that is very powerful about feminism is that, of course, there are so many different feminisms and different ways that women's lives take shape given class and race and culture and place. And yet there are some really, really important through lines, right? And you know, as somebody who's reported on women's rights and women's health all over the world, these issues don't look identical everywhere, but there are still these common threads and commonalities. And I think if we can understand where those connections exist and then where the differences manifest, right? And if we can hold both of those things at once, that is a much more effective feminist movement and a much more effective feminist strategy than assuming that women's lives are either totally distinct and separate by race, place, culture, or assuming that whatever the dominant group of women in any society is defines womanhood, right? And so I do think there is a way to hold that in parallel. And that I think is the task and should ultimately be the goal of any feminist movement. More difficult to do than perhaps that sounds. But Anushay, one of the things that I think your book does really well is it does exactly that, right? You contextualize what you're talking about in terms of race, in terms of place, right? That not every woman has, for example, the same risk of dying in childbirth, right? Every woman or every person who has a child has a risk of dying in childbirth. That's a connective tissue. That's something we should all care about. And yet, depending on your class, depending on your racial background, depending on which country you live in, that risk can be astronomically heightened, right? So that's one of those differences and distinctions that is so crucial for the feminist movement to really home in on. And so I do think your book is a perfect example of this, right? Of making these connections and then also not trying to pretend that all women's lives are equally as either privileged or difficult.
I think that is an excellent answer. My next question, Sophia, I want to give to you because even after writing this book, even after all the studies that came out last year, even after what we've seen in the pandemic, even after what the pandemic has exposed to the world, how America's healthcare system, before we even get to maternal health, operates against such distinct racial lines. I don't know if I can say this, but I was interviewed, for a publication last week, and this journalist was very young, but anyhow, she came and asked me in my home if I ever think that it's just a one-off when I read these stories or hear about these stories. And I was like, well, first of all, she has not read my book. But the statistics, Sophia, that Black women in America are not just more likely to die, but 243% more likely to die than their white counterparts. And if you are an educated Black woman, you are actually 5 times more likely to die than a white woman with a high school degree. What is going on there that people are not understanding, that people can still ask, maybe it's just a one-off?
So I have a few things I want to say. First, congratulations on the book. We're all very proud of you, and welcome to everyone watching us. I love Politics in Prose. I love being in the store in Bethesda, and it's awesome. And I look forward to when we can all do that again. I think Jill made some great points, and everyone so far has really made some good points. There's 3 things I want to focus on answering your question. First, we have to get men in the room. If we can't get men to understand, because men are still the majority of doctors, men are still the majority of hospital administrators, men are still the majority of owners of healthcare, whether they are first aid clinics or those first care centers or whatever they are. Men still run healthcare, even though I have a mother who just retired after 40 years of being a registered nurse in labor and delivery. And it's a very female profession at the nurse level, but it is not a very female-run profession, as I just explained, whether it's in pharmaceutical care, whatever. Men still run our medical care. So a book like this is critical for men, male doctors, etc., to hone in on. And I want to encourage you to get into some of these big pharma companies, the hospitals, etc., and get into the education pieces when doctors are being educated, Anushay, because that's how you're going to make the change, right? That's number 1. Number 2, the intersectionality piece that you addressed with Jill is critical. And you remember when I introduced you at the party, I called on our white sisters right there and I said, hey, you got to lift as you climb, because as we know, as the baby boomer white men are aging out, they've made a place for their daughters. Me as a lawyer in a big law firm back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was nobody who looked like me, definitely nobody who looked like you. And some people that looked like Jill, but very few. And white men were our mentors. And when white men finally, the bell went off and they said, well, gee, I got a daughter who's going to go to college. And gee, I got a daughter who may want to be a lawyer or a CEO or a doctor or an engineer. I guess I got to make room for women to come up to the C-suite and become partners, et cetera, too. So when white men connected the dots that their daughters would have to get out there and they wanted to lift those barriers, they still didn't see me and you as their daughters. They just didn't. They didn't make that connection. And so I think on those two pieces, it's really important that our white allies, men and women, see this and speak to it, because we know the sad truth in America, whether it's politics, whether it's business, whether it's medicine, people hear white people differently when they speak than they do when we say it. When we say it, it often comes across, this is answering your question, when a Black woman says, I feel like I'm having a heart attack, and she goes to the ER, she's often sent home and dismissed. Her symptoms may be different. And the male doctor, men are, look, guys, we love you. We're not picking on you. We're trying to bring you to the table. We're trying to call you in, not call you out, okay?
I'm fine.
And so I think it's really important that though we understand that Black women who may have comorbidities, for example, diabetes, hypertension, asthma, whatever it is, they may have different symptomology when they go to the ER for the same problem. And Jill and I were both experienced heart attack symptoms. We're both women. We're both in pretty good shape and healthy, but we may have different experiences of what we're experiencing, and we're going to be heard differently because of the filter of race, racism, and sexism. And I know that's not a popular thing to say. And to the young journalist that was interviewing you, boy, these young women frustrate me. And they frustrate me because it's our fault, because we haven't taught them better. But they've grown up in a world that's very different from someone that me that's plus 50 grew up in. And the world I grew up in, women were ascending. They grew up in a world seeing a woman vice president. There's been a Black president. The woman vice president happens to be of color. So in their world, well, what racism, what sexism, what are you talking about, right? There's an assumption there that everything is fine. So a book like this is critical, and I'll finish with this and let someone else speak. A book like this is critical because it fits into the moment we're in right now, which is what I said when I introduced you. This isn't just a book about healthcare and women of color. It's a political book, really. It's a book about the dynamics of racism and sexism and intersectionality and how they play on us as women of color when we just don't feel good and we're trying to get well, when we're trying to get help, when we want to have a baby. And so I thank you for writing in, and I thank you to my sisters here who've all made great points, and I look forward to further dialogue.
Jill, what was it that you wanted to say? Did you want to say something? You hit of course, Sophia hit all the nails on the head. What was it that you wanted to say?
I was just making a joke. I was saying, I don't mind picking on men. Sophia was being very kind. We're not going to pick on them. But I mean, to the point you were making, Sophia, and I think Anushay, it's your book. So I want to hear you answer a question, if that's okay. I'm stealing your mic for a second.
We're all so good at this, you guys. Professional panelists. Yes, please
right?
do.
But I'm hearing all of us talk about this need to pull men in, and I agree with that. I think that that's absolutely right. But the reality is that men have lived alongside women since the beginning of time, right? And yet we have somehow never succeeded in making men care about women as much as they care about themselves, or as much as, frankly, to care about even their female partners as much as they care about their daughters, right?
Right.
Which I think is its
That daughter point, yes.
Interesting and bizarre thing. And, and again, to the men watching, if you're here, you're probably not the people that I'm talking about. So if it doesn't feel like it's about you, it's probably not about you. But there is a enormous number of men. We've seen many of them on Twitter in the past couple of days talking about how paternity leave is for wusses and men don't need to take it. Men have had a long time to catch up. Women have been telling our stories of trauma, of rape, of unsafe abortions, of being forced through pregnancies, of almost dying in childbirth, of the women we know dying in childbirth. We've been telling these stories for a really long time. We've been doing that work of trying to build that empathy for a really long time. And it's working on some men, and frankly, it is not working on most policymakers. It is not working on most men in power. I think a lot of people, frankly, just don't care. And I don't know how much more women can kind of like flay ourselves out there in public, hoping that maybe this story, this trauma will be enough to change men's minds. And so, Anushay, one of the things I like that you do in your book is that you, without saying like, this is women's obligation to fix it ourselves, you do offer women some tools, right? And some sense of entitlement, and in the best possible definition of that word, to advocate for themselves. And assuming, because your book is brand new, I'm guessing most folks in the audience haven't read it yet. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what those tools are, what women can do in our own lives and in our own healthcare, and in our own communities, to really push for something better.
That is such a great question. That is such a great question. And it took me a really long time to answer that in my book, because I didn't want people to feel like it was women's fault and that the onus is on women, because it's always like that, right? You got raped, but what did you do? Still, by the way, you almost died in childbirth. What did you do? I had somebody tell me yesterday, I have to write another book about this. Yesterday, somebody told me to my face, I went to the hospital to die, and that C-sections are better for babies and their mothers. Wow. And that's a whole other topic, but I don't want it. You're right. It's not women's responsibility, but there are things we can do until that rest of the world catches up. And one of the most interesting things that I came across in my research is that we are taught that it's the doctor is the most important person in our healthcare, but we should actually approach it as a team effort. And the most important member of that team for women's health is you, the woman. You know the most. Bring as much family history as you can. Tell the doctor as much as you can. Bring somebody with you. This was something feminists kept telling me, that I was like, this is so offensive and sexist, but they were like, it's so effective. Bring a man with you to your doctor's appointment. Bring a male witness. The doctor will take you more seriously. Women who have endometriosis being neglected, but they bring their male partner, it's like, we can't have sex. Oh, the doctor is on it. So
let me intervene there for a moment, Anushay. You said something, I don't want to lose this. When I was going into college, I wanted to do ROTC for the Navy. I had endometriosis. This is 1980, like, I don't know, 6. And they would not allow me in because I had endometriosis, because they didn't know what it was. They thought it was some terrible thing. I was a star athlete, track runner, all state, everything. And I had endometriosis, and the United States Navy would not let me into ROTC because I had endometriosis. And I bring that up to say, I hope that things are different now, but the lack of understanding about women's bodies, the lack of understanding about something, back then endometriosis was this new kind of thing. They didn't know a lot about it, but they treated it like it was a death sentence or something. And it was like this horrible thing, and it really wasn't. I mean, you know, you could deal with it. It could be treated with the low dose birth control pill is really how they fixed it, right? And so I just thought it was interesting because you brought that up, and there are just these taboos about us as women, and even as young women, and things that they kind of say, oh, you know, that's something we don't know about, so we're not dealing with that, and that's a woman thing, a woman issue.
A woman
you know
issue.
what I mean? A woman issue. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that was great. An excellent point. I did not know that you had endometriosis.
Well, I don't go around with a flag and tell everybody that, but
can I tell you, I said this to Padma Lakshmi, whose story is also featured in the book, that if I feel like if there's one disease that kind of embodies everything I'm trying to say in the pain gap, the invisible conditions, chronic pain, it's endometriosis.
It ruined my fertility. It threw me into, I had premature ovarian failure very young. It ruined a relationship where I wanted marriage and children. It was terrible. And so there are consequences to our health as women that, again, when there's no understanding on the part of men who see you as damaged if you can't produce children. I mean, I'm just being honest. I can do it now because I don't care. In my 50s, I say whatever I want to say. But I think that it was horrible as a young woman, and it was horrible having a stigma or having something you didn't know really what was wrong with you, right? And nobody could really help you understand it. And the same with women with fibroids. Fibroids do major damage to women's fertility, their bodies. I mean, and particularly women of color, particularly Black women.
Yes, Black women.
Yeah.
Soraya, I wanted the next question to go to you because I felt like a lot of times either I should just, either quote entire chapters from your book in my book or just have you in my book somehow, which I actually think I did, aside from you blurbing it. But I wanted to ask you, how are we? Women's pain is at most, there was a great quote in my book, it's expected and it's denied, but we're not allowed to get angry from it. Especially women of color. We are not allowed to get emotional or angry. We're the first ones to be written off as hysterical. What do we do?
Well, I think it's interesting. There are three things too that occurred to me. The first is because of the prohibitions and punishments that come with our expressing anger, which, by the way, I would say sometimes isn't even anger. It might just be assertiveness. It might be fear. It might be aggression, right? I mean, if you're in an emergency room, for example, and you're really scared and you're trying to demand help, that the response, a lot of women will self-police themselves so that people don't think they're hysterical, and they'll silence themselves so they don't appear angry. And actually, I think it's really notable that there's some super interesting studies of emergency rooms, as you know, there are lots of them, but the one that really comes to mind with your question is that in general, white men will get attention in an emergency room faster and will also express themselves with anger more quickly and get results from that anger. And all of that is enmeshed with these ideas and stereotypes about gender and race and class and how we're supposed to express ourselves. And so there's the element of anticipating that. We preemptively try and control other people's responses by not getting panicky or angry or assertive, or even using sort of dominant ways of speaking that some of us just have. Like, some of us just have dominant ways of speaking. But we have to try and control all of that. And we have to try and control it in moments of fear and pain. And so that's one thing, which is, yes, the public and social construction of those emotions contributes directly to the way we deal with pain or try and seek relief from pain. The second thing that's really interesting to me, just actually looking at all four of you here, is the relationship between pain and pleasure and shame. Because, we're talking about pain, but in fact, we're also talking about pleasure and desire and shame and rage being mediators of pleasure and pain, I think. Jill's written about happiness. I've written about things like orgasm gaps. You're writing explicitly about pain. Sophia, you've sort of cut through a lot of these, I know, in your work. And so to me, the question is sort of, okay, well, the way we think about pain, who has the right to claim pain? Who has the right to get solace from pain? Who do we expect to bear the burden of pain as a sacrifice? Because a lot of these things that are related in particular to sex, sexual organs, sexual pleasure, sexual freedom, which then get conflated with reproduction, pregnancy, childbirth, all of those things get thrown into the woman bucket that we're not supposed to talk about because we're actually supposed to be ashamed of any of that. The desire, the pain, the pleasure, the childbirth, all of that ends up, I think, really just being culturally silenced over and over and over again.
Anushay, let me say something.
And now I've lost the thread of my third point, which is in there somewhere.
Let us know when it comes back.
Yeah, hopefully it'll come back, but I want to illustrate something she said in real time because she nailed something about white men and how they get attention. So as many of you know, if you follow me on social media, I got a breakthrough case of COVID this past August. And fully vaccinated at our family home down in South Carolina, at the beach, stayed at the beach house, did everything right. But I was in a red state where people do not wear masks. They had low vaccination, and lo and behold, I got it. So we got back. I, of course, had to quarantine, but it was going in the wrong direction. So my doctor had me admitted to the hospital so I could get the antibodies and the regen. When we're going into the emergency room to check in, I swear to God, this is a true story. A white man comes in screaming at the top of his lungs, and he's walking in his wife, and he's like, my wife is, I think she's having a heart attack. I think she's having a heart attack. And I was checking in. So I immediately stepped aside because, you know, not being a doctor, you don't have to be a genius to know if somebody's having a heart attack. You know, you want to get that person seen. And the nurses were saying to him, sir, we're coming right now. He's like, get your mother. He starts screaming right now. She doesn't matter. Points at me, points, and is like, get to my wife. And he had been drinking. So at this point, the security guy steps up. And to your point, I could see this was all going to go really bad. And I said to the nurse who was taking care of me, stop, get out of there, go around, get this woman, get her in. I can wait. And everything got quiet. And the point is, what you said, I saw the eruption coming. White man came in off the chain, demanded that, and again, wife having a heart attack, we're all on board. We want her to go first. But the way he conducted himself was horrible. And his wife, you could see, poor thing, was crying and embarrassed. She's probably, I guarantee she's a victim of domestic violence. I probably shouldn't say that, but I believe that with all my heart, just because the way she was cowering and the way he was acting. But me as the Black woman in the ER at my bougie Loudoun County hospital down the street where there's nobody looks like me. And I said, okay, please, can you, I told her, stop, get out, go take care of this lady now. And that diffused the whole thing. And my mom was kind of pissed at me. She's a nurse. She's like, you got COVID and you're pretty sick. You got a fever. And I was like, yeah, but it's okay. But your point is, I mean, this literally just happened a month or so ago.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
real. That's a true
Can I
story.
add something to that? Because I think we may get to this conversation about the resistance that Jill described, just the resistance to understanding it, wanting to understand it, and then actually making the connection to resources and politics and change and all of that. But I will say this, when I had my book fact checked like 3 separate times because I'm paranoid, right? And at one point, a lawyer who was fact checking it came back, and I had written an entire paragraph about women and heart attacks and exactly what Sophia described, in that we experience different symptoms and that they're often not recognized by medical personnel, or they're dismissed as anxiety or, you know, hysteria, whatever it may be. And the fact checker, and mind you, I am a firstborn Catholic girl, so I have like, here are my 27 links to research that verifies the sentence that I just wrote. And so I had done that, and he had written big red letters, remove this. I advise you remove this. And so I wrote back and I said, well, why would I remove this? And he says, well, it's just not true. Men have heart attacks more than women. And I was like, wait, did you read this? Like, did you actually look at the sources? And he goes, it's just not true. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, don't even argue with me. It's the reason that we do the research we do, right? But it was a very interesting cognitive response that he had. And it didn't have anything to do with those facts. And he was angry that I was asserting that this was the case and that women, in fact, do experience high rates of cardiac illness and heart attacks. And so I went back to my editor and I said, you know, I'm struggling with this fact checker for the following reasons. And I've explained and I've sent the research, and yet he keeps coming back at me with this. So I'm going to write an additional 250 words about it. And he can fact check that too. And if you decide that you're going to remove it after, that's fine, but I'm letting you know why I'm adding the 250 words. But it was so interesting to me because he was very angry. He was not happy with this information. And I actually think that's a very typical response to the, you know, it goes along with the male fragility, white fragility, the sense that maybe you have privilege in the situation, but you don't feel privileged. And then it becomes this sort of morass and very sort of complex interpersonal relationships. But in fact, the consequence is that ultimately we're just expected to have the pain and not complain about it.
Yes.
Like, don't, you know, there's no right way to complain about pain if you are in this situation.
They would rather, sometimes I feel like people would rather have us die from our pain than complain about our pain. I have a question. I'm going to open this up for all four of you. What role do female doctors and nurses have to play? I get this a lot, but I want us all to answer it because I feel like it's such a feminist question. What role do female doctors and nurses have to play in dismantling internalized misogyny that they may display in the medical system? I had many female doctors dismissing my pain. So did I. Who wants to take us off on this one? It's my next book. Women internalize misogyny as well, by the way.
Yeah, I was just going to say that to me, there are a lot of men who understand and a lot of women who don't. I think it has less to do with whether it's a man or a woman, honestly, because we're all immersed in the culture. Mm-hmm. And there are, you know, some extremely introspective, thoughtful, feminist men who are doctors who try, in the same way that there are women doctors who do that. But yeah, women are also, we share these biases, and it takes a lot of work to really step back and think, what am I assuming here? What am I, do I exact do I demand more of women patients in this particular regard?
That's an excellent point. Jill, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, this is sort of one of those both and answers. I think anytime you have more women in any given field, that is a good thing, right? I think there is some good evidence. I don't know about female doctors and nurses, but certainly in the realm of politics and in the realm of business, when you have more women at the table, for example, women who run large companies tend to hire many more women than male CEOs do. When you have women in positions of elected office, those women tend, I mean, in the US, women tend to be more liberal than men, but women also tend to do more on legislation that is important to women. That said, that isn't universal, right? As we can tell by looking at women in Congress, it is not the case that every single woman in elected office or every single woman running a business or every single female doctor or female nurse is going to be better on women's issues than a man, right? That's a really reductive and silly way of looking at the world. And it's also like demonstrably, provably false. As Soraya said, women live in our society too. We're also swimming in these waters. So I think at the same time that it is important to say that women should be equally represented in the medical field, right? Just out of basic fairness. And also because I do think that would probably improve the medical field in terms of not making men's bodies and men's experiences the like de facto majority norm. And we should also have, frankly, more men in the kind of supportive roles within the medical field. So as home health aides, as nurses, as things like that. That is not going to be the like silver bullet solution. It is one, I would say, very important step. But until we change this sort of very systemic design where we do treat men's bodies as the norm and women's bodies as deviant, and where we do treat white bodies as the norm and bodies of color as deviant or different or somehow moving away from what we've decided, this white male body is just like the standard from which everything else grows. Until we stop doing that, I don't think we're going to get to a point where women and people of color, and particularly women of color, are able to access, high quality and equal fair medical care.
Oh my goodness. I wish I could just absorb your brain. That was such an amazing answer. One thing that is really interesting that I wanted to ask you guys about is that you've read my book. And you know that there's a lot of research in the book. A lot of people have thought that this entire book was about me almost dying in childbirth, my birth story, or me just going off on my thoughts. And so many people have come up to me and been like, oh, there's so much research in it. We're so surprised. Why are people so surprised that finally the research is backing what women have been saying for hundreds of years? Women's pain is dismissed. We wait longer to be seen. Men, if they are in pain, they are taken seriously. They're given a diagnosis. Like, why are people surprised that the research backs what women say?
Well,
we have no credibility.
I think it gets back to stereotypes, right? When I wrote my first book, Black Women Redefined, Dispelling Myths and Discovering Fulfillment in the Age of Michelle Obama, we commissioned a lot of first research focus groups because what we really wanted to focus on was professional Black women who were coming of age and of course, we had this beautiful new Black first lady who was brilliant and smart and accomplished and all of those things, as well as a wife and a mother. And we wanted to test attitudes of Black men towards Black women, of white men towards Black women, of white women towards Black women. And inevitably, all the stereotypes held up. And so when my book had the research, it made it a lot harder for people to work around. And people were surprised because, again, we're emotional, remember? We rant, we go off, we're angry. So we don't think things through, and we don't do research with our PhD having selves or our JDs or our MBAs or whatever it is. And those stereotypes hold true. And I'll tell you a great story, again, feeding into what everybody has said here about how when we as women of color put something out into the atmosphere, this thing is killing us emotionally. This thing is damaging us at work. We have physical pain that we can't talk about. We're ignored, first of all, and then we're labeled. And I never forget that the editor at the time, she's retired now, the Chicago Tribune, was looking at, the advanced copy of the book. They were going to do a piece on it. And so she asked me to give her a call. I called and she said, I'm having a hard time with this book. And I was like, why? And she said, well, I just don't believe Black women go through this. Girl, it took every bit of me not to drop some F-bombs and go ballistic. And I took a deep breath and I said, so yeah, you would know more about being a Black woman than me, I'm sure. And she was like, oh, well, I didn't mean that. I'm like, of course you did. You just told me as a white woman that you know that this can't be true for Black women. And I just wrote the whole damn book and told you about it and backed it up with research. But you know better than me. That's the kind of stuff, folks, we have to deal with every single day of our lives as women of color in this country. That's a true story. I mean, she apologized. The paper apologized. Don't apologize. How dare you tell me what my experience is not? I would never do that to someone that shared an experience with me. It's my job to shut up and listen. I'm just saying. Sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional there, but that story still pisses me off because it happens still to this day where we are marginalized, and our white sisters get marginalized too. If they say something, it's not their race, it is their gender. We get both. So I think that, I like to say we get the burdens of both and the benefits of neither, meaning, men of color are at least men and white women are white. We get neither one of those. We get both the burdens of them. So
I hate to say this, and I hope my daughters don't hear me, even though they're both outside, but in my next life, if I could come back as a man in South Asia, as a man, as a person with a penis in South Asia.
Oh, Lord God, help me.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe I would be king of the world, literally. But yes, you are right. Even when we've done the work, it's incredible. What is that? Entitlement, or just because we are seen as so inferior? Because let's say if, I don't know, if I said it's really cold in Russia and a Russian man was like, no, it's not that cold, I'd probably be like, you know what, my opinion, but you would probably know better. Why can they never say you would know better? What is that about?
Hard to undo hundreds of years in America. But can't even get into the whole global conversation, right?
Right.
You can't undo sexism and racism took a long time to put those constructs together, right? It took a long time to put women in their place, to put people of color in their place. And so since the 60s, that's when you've really seen the gains begin to really happen. That's only 50 plus years ago.
Yeah, it's not that long ago. So I've told you this when I've met you, but the opening of your book, Rage Becomes Her, when your mom is breaking her wedding china. Tell us you are kind of like the anger specialist for the feminist anger specialist for me. We are not allowed. What do we do if we're denied the right to be angry? What are we supposed to do? Make tea?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, and I think this is related to your prior question, which is that some people, we just assume they're rational, right? And other people, we assume they're irrational. And we kind of associate that with emotions like anger, right? To get angry is supposed to be irrational. One of the things I talk about in the book is that it's a very rational emotion. if you're angry, you're probably angry for a good reason. It's not because you haven't thought about things. Rage is a different matter, because by the time people are enraged, there's so many maladaptations that have happened along the way. But I think it goes back to the idea of who gets to be knowledgeable, who gets to claim not just knowledge, but then to assert that their knowledge is universal. And so I would almost guarantee you that all of us here on this panel have had the experience in media of being asked to write from our perspectives, right? Why don't you write as that ambiguously beige woman that is from somewhere south of Florida, is the way I get it, right? Like, we're not exactly sure what you are, but we know you're not this other thing, right? And so it's either you're a woman, or you're a Black woman, or you're a person who has a specific experience of the world that couldn't possibly give generalized insight about something objectively. That's really the underlying message there. Whereas other people, generally speaking, Anglo-European men, their identities are conflated with those norms, with what is rational, with what is knowledgeable, with what is objective. And so maybe actually, along with the last 50 years of all of the change that Sophia mentioned, one of the things that's been so jarring to people has been questioning the notion of objectivity at all, and that got turned into questioning facts, which is a whole different cup of tea. But in fact, what happens is we're only supposed to speak to our specific personal experiences, because what we think or have to say just isn't assumed to be relevant to more than ourselves, in the sense that it can't be social or political or epistemically valid.
Oh, that is a quote. Jill, I want to ask you, what is it like? I mean, do you ever find yourself in conversations where people, because you kind of have, what Du Bois said, right? The veil. You kind of have this dual visibility. You know what it's like to be a white woman, okay, and have all the privileges, but you really get it. You really get what women of color, what we're talking about, what our struggles are. You're one of the few white feminist writers that when you write something, it's not like you're trying to co-opt, So what do you say sometimes when you are around a bunch of white people and they say something that's very offensive that maybe you get and they don't get, about maybe even race or gender?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to say, I'm not sure I do get it, to be honest. Like, I feel like I try to be a decent person, right? And read and listen and engage in conversations. But, I think I'm 100% positive I make missteps all the time and I get stuff wrong and I unintentionally exclude other people's experiences and perspectives.
Trying, like, right?
All of the time. Of course, not intentionally, but,
But you're a real ally. I'm trying to say you're a real ally.
Right? And so, yes, I do certainly try to be a decent human being. It doesn't always work. So anyway, I didn't want to put myself out there as like, hi, I'm the white woman who gets it. Like, that's, I don't think that
white savior,
right. But, in terms of the work that white people can do among themselves, I mean, I do think that's really crucial, right? I think there's a lot of self-editing that goes on in spaces that are more racially diverse, right? And more homogenous spaces, I should say. And in all white spaces, I think there are certainly things that white people say to each other that they wouldn't say if a Black person was in the room or if a South Asian person was in the room. And so I do think it's really crucial for, all of us who do care about these issues of equality and, general fairness, to be a voice that, as I think Sophia used this language earlier, that calls people in, right? And that pushes back on stereotypes, that challenges sort of unhelpful or, I'm honestly not in rooms very often where somebody says something blatantly racist. Like, I live in Brooklyn and we have a pretty diverse group of friends. And like, it's just that is not something that comes up in that sort of very, very stereotypical, like Archie Bunker way in my life very often. But what does come up very often is people saying stuff that, is speaks to some sort of racial bias or gender bias, or some kind of perspective that is not like somebody saying something that is a slur or something that is like this group of people is bad, but more is like, I don't understand why the Black Lives Matter protesters want to defund the police. Like, why make that argument? Like, isn't that such a why does this group want to do X? That kind of blends an entire pretty diverse group and movement together in what is ostensibly a political question, but clearly has some underlying discomfort. And so to me, that's a really good and interesting place to open up conversation, to be a voice that pushes back on this assumption of agreement among white people, which is, I think, a thing that happens in private. People, I think, often kind of assume that we see these issues similarly. We're similarly uncomfortable with social change. And so I think being a voice that does push back on that does, in a way that is hopefully not super self-righteous, because I don't think that winds up being very helpful, can kind of move the conversation in a different direction and present, a viewpoint that suggests that, no, we're not all aligned on this, right? And then in these moments of movement where a lot of us are in different places, and that's probably a good thing.
Just add that that's the same for us as African Americans, and I'm sure for Southeast Asians and everyone else, that when we're with our clique and our group, right, there are assumptions that we make, there are experiences that are shared, and we're much more comfortable using language or saying things because there's shared experience. And so I think the difficulty we're all having, and this is happening, look, I'm a professor on a college campus, and you talk about diversity and differences and trying to navigate those so that everybody's heard, everybody's respected, but people also are allowed to maintain their individuality, right? And their perspectives and their views. And it's not easy. That's the great challenge of America. And that's what I love about this book. Again, bringing it back to the book. And I think, Jill, you've done a masterful job of explaining, how someone like yourself in allyship, you have the opportunity, if you're sitting with some of your fellow, I hate this term Caucasian, I don't have a better term, but y'all Caucasian brothers and sisters, right? Your people, my people, your people, everybody's people, right? But if you're sitting there and somebody does make a joke or somebody says something, it's not that you don't have a sense of humor. You have an opportunity to say, hey, you know what? Okay, let me give you my perspective on this. And by the way, I was just a part of this panel where we were talking about this thing is real about Black women and women of color dying in childbirth more, et cetera, et cetera. So we have opportunities to enlighten people, right, and help people to see a different perspective. And I think, oh my goodness. And I think that's what this is all about. So Anushay, you've really done a great job with this book. The research is outstanding. Everything you've shared is so important because we're in a big healthcare moment in this country right now because of the pandemic and globally. And we see the death rate is much higher for Black people and people of color, mostly because of the vaccine issue, right? But the lack of information, the fear that somehow if I take this vaccine, we've had to fight with people in our family, threaten them to get the vaccine because they bring up the Tuskegee experiment. I'm like, you weren't around during the Tuskegee experiment. And but they've got all this stuff to say why they shouldn't do it because racism. And I'm like, okay, I got you, but I'm alive. I took it. I'm good. I didn't die. So, you know what I mean? And so we're all dealing with this. And I think the book does a really good job of just making us recognize the difference, the nuance of color and gender in every damn thing we do, period.
Seriously, that's a quote. But the other thing is that people were saying, yes, I mean, racism. And people who don't like my work always say, well, you have to make it all about racism. It's not always about race. But in America, I feel like it is.
Ooh, wait.
And there was a great quote I have in my book by this Black woman doctor who says, we are not just scared. We are not just hesitant about getting the vaccine. We remember. I mean, there are valid things that have happened in American history, right? Medical history, testing on Black people. I mean, it just goes on and on. Tuskegee is just a small blip. So I see this in
Henrietta Lacks.
Yes. that just happened. Not just
Her family's still trying to get justice all these years later. And people who got rich, their family poor, nothing. We should answer these questions. You got a lot of them.
I know I do, but I don't know. I'm being kind of selective with them. Okay, here's one. Here is one for you, Soraya. Are you familiar with the term sacred rage? It was new to me recently, but resonates.
Wow.
I will tell you, first of all, since writing this book, I have had women all over the world contact me to talk to me about the names of various aspects of rage in feminist history, culturally in different contexts. So I have heard about sacred rage, and it does resonate. I think I've been fascinated by how many terms people have come up with to try and describe feminist anger. You know, I mean, very little, I feel like very little of what I said in my book about feminist anger was new. I was literally just trying to share as much thinking as I could about this emotion, because it gives us insights into so many of the issues we've talked about, right? Kind of a Trojan horse for talking about any of these issues. But yes, I think sacred rage, which has been elaborated on by various writers, which is that sense that it's a justifiable rage, and that I'm not much of a gender essentialist, so I don't really adhere to the idea that there's some special feminine anger that buds in all of us and then is lit aflame. But yes, I think it is appropriate in some context for some people.
That is an excellent, and thank you for explaining that. Okay, well, we have this one question that, I mean, I think a lot of women have, so I'm going to ask it, which is, we've seen a lot of success when it comes to women winning elections. And yes, even though I'm going to summarize this question because I get it a lot. Yes, so America's political participation in women in government isn't as high as it should be. As it's increasing, could be better. Is it going to make more of an impact when we have more women in government? Is it, ladies?
Yes, absolutely. It already has. Take Senator Amy Klobuchar, who I really like. And again, I'm a longtime moderate Republican woman, but I think she's great. She's really been on this Medicare issue, and she's really been talking about the impact of prescription drugs and the cost. And we know as women, particularly as they get older, if they're widowed, if they're never married, no children, whatever, their poverty is a big indicator, right? There's women's economic security decreases as they age if they're not married and secure. There's a whole dynamic around this, right? And so she's marrying the two of how we have to pay attention to women and can they afford their medications? Can they afford their care? And that's something a man's never going to think about. And if you begin to think about this discussion in the infrastructure bill, and you look at the child care, look at all the women that dropped out. 4 million women during the pandemic dropped out of the workforce because they had to stay at home and take care of their kids, their aging parents, and they had to try to balance. And at some point they said, I can't do it. I just have to focus on this and I'll have to suck it up. And there's a direct correlation there between financial security, my ability to provide childcare for my child so I can go to work or not. And so these are issues that women get because women deal with these issues, women's health, all those things. Men just aren't thinking about those things. They're thinking about blowing stuff up, the industrial defense complex and all these other things they're thinking about. They're just thinking about different stuff. So yeah, I think it's gonna make a big difference.
I love that answer. Jill, this question is for you. So the media can walk on eggshells and use a lot of euphemisms. Anyway, but it's basically saying, okay, when discussing women's pain, we're not being clear about what we're talking about, which diminishes the impact of reporting. What's one taboo within women's healthcare that you wish was more openly discussed?
Ooh, my list is, can I name more than one? Yeah. I think there's so much that remains taboo about women's healthcare. And it's one of the reasons, Anushay, I'm so glad you wrote this book, because I think the book touches on so many of these taboos and writes about them in a way that is not taboo or stigmatizing. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Obviously we talk a lot about abortion as a political issue. I don't think we often talk about abortion as a a choice that women make that enables the rest of their lives, right? And one of the most powerful moments for me is, as a young person, I was in college and was a member of my school's like pro-choice team, and we were debating the pro-life club. And one of the students in the pro-life club said to our team, like, well, if your mother had an abortion, you wouldn't be here. And the woman sitting next to me grabbed the mic and she said, actually, my mother did have an abortion, and that is why I'm here.
Oh,
and
yes.
that was such a powerful moment, because we don't think about that issue in terms of how it does set women up for the whole rest of their lives, right? To have the children they go on to choose to have, to care for the children they already have, to walk their, the path of career or life or adventure that they want, maybe just to keep their heads above water, right? And so I think abortion as a crucial tool for women's happiness, for women's equality, is something that I think feminists talk about also kind of in euphemism, but don't always put real life examples on. So that's one. And I would also say the degree to which childbirth has long-term, often really painful and really negative effects on women's bodies, and that women are just expected to tolerate that. And luckily, you're all here talking about a book that addresses exactly this. But when you read the statistics about how many women after giving birth continue to have painful sex, continue to be incontinent, have long-term physically, not fully disabling problems, but issues that if they were happening to men, and if they made sex extremely painful or close to impossible for men, would absolutely not be tolerated. But because we expect motherhood itself to be such a sacrifice, there's this idea that any woman who complains about the pain that she's in, or complains about not being able to achieve a level of pleasure that she was able to achieve pre-motherhood, that woman must be a bad mother, must be selfish, just must not get it, I think is still a really pervasive taboo. And I have a newsletter on Substack, and I wrote about this, and it was the newsletter that I got the most responses possibly ever on, that one, and one about regretting having kids, that so many women were just like, yes, I also was denied pain medication when I was postpartum. I also, have not been able to have pleasurable sex since kids, and my doctor just tells me that's normal. It's such a common problem in women's lives. And I think women are very shamed into thinking that they're entitled to bodies that are not just pain-free, but also pleasure affirming and pleasure capable, especially mothers.
That's heartbreaking to hear. Just as a closing point, we think we have made a lot of progress, and we have. But man, when you listen to this discussion on our health and our medical care and how we're believed or not believed and how we're treated, even like I said, once you're infertile or something like that, that's game over for a lot of guys. Like, you're no longer, doesn't matter if you're wonderful, whatever, if those ovaries aren't working right, hey, and that's just real, that we're still dealing with that stuff in the 21st century. It's kind of scary, actually. It really is. Thank you.
It's infuriating and scary. Julia, I know you want to, I am going to pass the mic on to you, but I really want to quickly say, if I am so lucky to have women like you guys in my life who I can call not only to read over my crappy book proposals, help me when I'm drowning, but you are actually, Soraya, I used to read your articles on HuffPost. For so long, you were that little icon above, the HuffPost. And now I can't believe I can call you. And Sophia, forget it, okay? I can't even believe that I have your number. And Jill, you were instrumental in this book proposal. I cannot thank you guys enough. And everyone who tuned in today, this is an education. I'm going to be rewatching the recording of this, so I hope everyone else.
Me too. Will we be able to share it? Will there be a link or something that we can post from, will Politics and Prose share it?
Yeah,
okay,
I'm going to be sharing this.
Thank you all so much, to the moon and back. It's always so meaningful when these discussions take place. I'm getting a little misty myself, but yes, to our attendees out there will be a recording of this discussion available. I will share this not only with panelists, but it will be up on Politics in Prose if you want to share it. I encourage everyone to follow the links we've placed in the chat to purchase your copy of The Pain Gap from us. We do have some signed copies available. Thank you, Anushay, for that. And please check out Soraya Shamali's work, Jill Filipovic's work, and of course, Sophia A. Nelson. We cannot thank you enough. Again, this book is The Pain Gap: How Sexism and Racism in Healthcare Kill Women. We can begin to address these issues by doing our part, by reading up, getting educated ourselves. Thank you to our audience out there engaging with this discussion. From our shelves to yours this evening, we hope everyone out there is continuing to stay strong, stay safe, and of course, stay well-read. Thanks to everyone again, and we will see everyone next time. Catch the recording, share this recording. Again, to the four of you, thanks very much from Politics in Prose, and good